Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Kang, Dr. Taekyung Kang, Deputy Director of International Division at KIC. It's also my pleasure to be able to hear renowned experts' insight, as well as to be the moderator of this session on cyber economic crimes. As an academic, I look to appreciate and learn from your collective wisdom. According to Korean police, the number of cybercrime incidents in 2019 alone was well over 1.8 million. About 84% of the incidents were crimes perpetrated through the use of information and communications network. Against the backdrop, this session aimed to draw up effective responses to cyber economic crimes, given the current state of cyber financial fraud, phishing, and money laundering. In this session, we'll have three renowned presenters and three discussants. The first presenter is Dr. Erwin Rutger Lockerfeldt. Dr. Lockerfeldt is an academic director of the Cybersecurity Research Center of the Hogeschool of Applied Sciences. Over the last decade, he worked on a number of cybercrime studies for the Dutch government and private companies. Dr. Lockerfeldt will give a presentation on financial cybercrime and situational crime prevention. We'll look to gain insight into financial cybercrime prevention strategy based on understanding the origin and growth processes of cybercriminal networks. Now, Dr. Lockerfeldt, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. This is Rutger Lockerfeldt from the Netherlands. Today, I will be talking about financial cybercrimes and situational crime prevention. I work for the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement and the Hague University of Applied Sciences. The NCR is a Dutch research institute, and me and my colleagues all study crime and law enforcement, and I lead the cybercrime cluster. And there we are specialized in doing studies like life course criminology into cybercrime criminal careers, the study of criminal networks, etc., etc. Very fundamental research. In the Hague University, we do much more applied research, and there we focus much more on the victim side of things. So I'm trying to combine both of these worlds in my work. Before I start, I also wanted to make sure that, I'm a criminologist. I study cybercrime, and cybercrimes are often seen as very technical crimes, which is, of course, true. However, we criminologists do have an important role in studying cybercrimes and better understanding cybercrimes, because the human factor still plays an important role, because I always say that the technical part is only a part of the modus operandi, and the attackers are still humans with their own motivations, with their own business models, with their own criminal careers. They work together with other criminals, so all of these processes of origin and growth are still very much important. And of course, the victims themselves also play a role willingly or unwillingly in the process of becoming a victim. So in the entire process of cybercrime, humans play a very vital role, and therefore criminologists should truly be much more involved into the study into cybercrime. So if you're interested in this topic, we published a research agenda a couple of years ago, as you can see on the left. You can download it for free, and we identified the major gaps in our knowledge related to human factor research into cybercrime and cybersecurity. We published it a couple of years ago, but I can tell you most of the topics that we then saw are still relevant today. The other publication I wanted to share with you is the one on the right, which is, to my knowledge, the latest book, edited book about human factor research. And it contains about 19 chapters of international authors of all sorts of topics related to human factor in cybercrime research. So if you're interested in that, see if you can get access to the library and download some of the chapters. of course, you can always send me or Thomas Holt an email about one of the chapters. So that's my basic introduction about the topic. I'm here to talk about cybercriminal networks that are carrying out financially motivated attacks. I published a number of studies about these criminal networks with various authors, as you can see on the slide here. So what I will do today is not tell you about one particular study, but more tell you about the main lines that were discovered over the past decade or so. And if you're interested in any of these studies, you can have a look at what you see on the screen here. So today I will be telling about cybercriminal networks, and all of the information I'm going to share with you is not only based on the papers I mentioned, but I think the most important aspect here is that it's based on the analysis of police files. In the Netherlands, we have access to police files. Well, not everybody, but if you're a scientist and if you have a good research idea and it can also help the police, then you're able to get access to police files. And this really helps us to break the walls of silence that are common when it comes to criminals, but might even be more in place when it comes to cyber criminals, because of course they don't really want to talk to researchers. They don't fill in surveys, so it's pretty hard to actually understand how they meet new people, how they recruit, how the networks start and then become larger, what the criminal capabilities are, etc., etc. So these police files are very relevant when it comes to finding out all sorts of details related to that matter. Because of the wide use of wiretaps, but also IP taps, so literally a tap on your IP address, and interrogations if they are able to catch somebody, observations, placing listening devices into houses, and of course, raid a house, do a house search, and then seize all of the interesting materials and analyze what's on there, including computers, USB sticks, etc., etc. And we get access to all of this raw data, and we are able to use them in our analysis to better understand cybercriminal networks. So this is basically what my presentation is based upon. I started doing this with 18 Dutch cases, and I published a couple of papers about that. Later on, we did the same in other countries, and at the moment we're still working on the Organized Crime Monitor, which is an instrument that has been established in 1995 and contains lots of the major organized crime cases in the Netherlands, now also including cybercrime cases, and we're still doing analysis on that data set today. And why is this important? Let me take you back about 10 years ago. I was already doing lots of research for the Dutch police about cybercrime, cybercrime reports, etc., etc., and I heard a lot of stories about cybercrime is changing the game, and it's these criminals don't meet in a traditional way, and all of the trust building processes are not really don't really matter anymore, because now we have the dark web and crypto markets, etc., etc. And I was very intrigued by that as a criminologist, thinking, okay, so this might change all of the things we know about criminal networks and how they operate and how we can break them down or stop them. However, when I started looking into the scientific databases, I could not really find lots of criminological pieces on cybercriminal networks. I would often find pieces of papers of computer scientists that analyzed a big forum or whatever, but there were not really lots of criminologists active in the field of studying cybercriminal networks. And it is important, because then I went back to the basics of traditional criminal networks, and I learned that most criminals don't work alone. Even for the most simple task, you have to use other people, and especially when it comes down to financially motivated crimes. Because you simply don't have all of the skills yourself to not only execute an attack, but also launder the money. So you need various people with various types of social capital. So social capital is contacts or skills or cash to be able to carry out financially motivated attacks successfully. mind you, this is all still, true for traditional criminal networks. So I was very intrigued if this was still true for cybercriminal networks, because if this is true, it means that your social network is very important, and we know that because criminals are not able to place an ad in a newspaper saying, "Hey, we're looking for somebody that can help us to launder money, or somebody that can help us carrying out certain attacks." No, of course, that's not something that you can do. So how do they recruit new people? Over the lines of family ties, friendship ties, etc., etc. So your social network is basically your opportunity structure to get involved into all sorts of crime and criminal networks. Also meaning that if you would draw a social network analysis of one of these international networks, that you would see all of these clusters as you see on this slide, because in the end, your social relationships are highly clustered and they are limited. I don't know any people in Korea. This might be the opportunity for me to actually meet somebody there and set up a network there. But at the moment, I only know people in Europe. So my social network is limited to a certain region of the world. And we can definitely see that within criminal networks too. This is, for example, a network, a drug trafficking network. And you see on the top left corner, all of the drug dealers in Amsterdam. And they are, interchangeable because, we know lots of these people. However, the orange broker that you see connects them with the supplier in South America. So traditionally, the broker or the offender convergence setting would be very, very relevant to actually gain your focus your criminal investigation onto. Of course, now the big question is that still the same when it comes to cybercriminal networks? Because everybody was telling me, have these crypto markets on the dark web, and well, they are there. This is an example of a somewhat older crypto market snapshot that we took a couple of years ago while we were monitoring about 27 of these markets. So these new criminal meeting places are there. And it also means that once you enter one of these meeting places, which is not very hard, by the way, you can just Google how you can enter one of these crypto markets. Once you enter them, it's very easy to get connected with people outside of your initial social network. So, for example, in this market, they're not only selling drugs, but also digital goods, which could be credit card credentials, which could be malware, etc., etc. So if I wanted to, get into contact with a malware writer from, let's say, Russia, this forum would enable me to do that in a very quick way. Furthermore, as they use rating systems and review systems, building trust is fairly easy, because just like eBay or another, auction site, once you've done a sell, the buyer is going to give you a review. So it's very easy to identify who are trustworthy sellers and buyers. So this is all changing, of course, the nature of how criminals meet, how they build up trust, etc., etc. The big question remains, however, are these crypto markets used by all of these criminal networks, and do they indeed change everything we know about criminal networks? And this was the focus of my studies into criminal networks. Our hypothesis was that all of these networks now relied heavily on crypto markets. They were short-lived, meaning they would find suitable co-offenders for a job. They would carry out the criminal activities and then find other people for the next job. And this was also something that you would see in all of these papers of computer scientists, that it was changing everything we know about crime. However, as you can see in the graph here, I have to explain this a little bit. Everything above the yellow dotted line is recruitment or ties based on these crypto markets, or online ties at least. So it can also be a market on the clear web. And everything below the line is just recruitment over the traditional lines of offline social context. So we expected all of the networks that we would analyze to be type 4 networks, as you can see here, because in theory, you don't need any social context anymore, because you can, by yourself, go online, find other trustable sellers and other people that enable you to commit your crimes. And we actually saw a number of these networks. So they do exist, these type 4 networks, which are completely new and are completely changing everything we know about how criminals meet and interact and what it means for trust. However, as you can also see on the slide, is there are much more of these types. And the first one is especially very interesting because I was not expecting to see that at all. But there are also still criminal networks, cyber criminal networks out there that rely completely on social ties. So it's completely comparable to the traditional criminal networks that we know. And then there are new types of networks, so 2 and 3, which are a mixture of these offline ties and recruiting specialists online. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. And this is what I would do for every case that I analyzed, every police code that I analyzed, which could contain 10, 20, 30, 40,000 pages of material. I would try to boil it down to one paper with the hierarchy in there, the different roles, and all sorts of relevant information. And here you can see an Amsterdam phishing network, and I published about this in Trends in Organized Crime in 2014 because I thought this was a unique case and I'm never going to see it again. But this is a case of a phishing crew in Amsterdam that made about $1 million in a year during the investigation, the criminal investigation. So apparently, of course, they did make more than $1 million, but at least we know that for sure that during that period they made about $1 million. So they were a fairly successful phishing crew. However, as you can see, there is only one IT guy involved here, which is the orange icon that you can see. So this criminal network existed. Basically, all of the core members were, you could call them traditional street criminals of Amsterdam. They all had a very large criminal career already, dealing drugs, etc., etc. They had contacts with the Dutch police on various occasions. So they were known criminals, and they moved from dealing drugs to also committing cybercrimes. And they only needed one IT person to help them build these websites and make the databases required, etc., etc. And this is interesting because this successful cybercriminal network basically existed out of traditional street criminals that knew each other from the streets where they grew up. They recruited these bank employees and these postal employees and money mules along the lines of their social ties. So they would just go outside in their hood and try to get more people involved. And the IT guy they also knew from scams that they performed in the past. The IT guy was staged in Nigeria, and we know that because we got a tap. The police had a tap on his phone, so we actually knew everything about how they would develop new websites and stuff like that. So this is a very, very traditional network that carries out cybercriminal networks, cybercriminal activities. The other example I want to give is a Latvian network, so an Eastern European network. And we know that they partly also executed their malware scams from England because the main writer was there. The other ones were all still in Latvia. And this is an interesting network because this is an example of a high-tech network that developed their own malware and were able to execute their scams in 7 different European countries successfully. And the biggest problem, however, was not infecting computers with malware and not transferring money from victim accounts, but getting enough money mule accounts, because in European countries, every bank has a profile of its customer, and if I would send money in the middle of the night to Latvia, an alarm bell goes off, and the bank knows that something fishy is going on, so they're going to stop this transfer. So what this Latvian network needed was a local crew of money mules, and they were recruited along the lines of family ties. So they would just find people in the Latvian community in big cities in the Netherlands and other countries where they attack people, and they tried to recruit new people just by using their own social network. So again, you see a very high-tech network that can execute scams from Latvia and the UK into different European countries, but they still needed their local embeddedness. So we always have the picture of hackers or cyber criminals as, a guy in a hoodie sitting alone in his room, but this picture is also true. It's much more, fairly traditional criminals that are out there in our cities and in our regions. I want to also address really quickly one of our findings related to the use of bitcoins. Because one thing that everybody always kept telling me is, okay, so Bitcoin is definitely, or other e-currencies are definitely going to change the need of money mules and stuff like that. Well, money mules are still out there, and they've been saying this to me for about 10 years, so it's not true. However, when you look at the crypto markets, of course, everybody's paying each other in e-currencies. I think at the moment, Bitcoin is the number one again, meaning that there is a black box indeed. However, we have excellent information from one of the cases that we analyzed in which the Dutch police took over one of these crypto markets and actually was able to investigate and observe the 5 biggest drug dealers, so these online drug lords. And indeed, they were selling their drugs over these crypto markets to customers all over the world, but mostly still in Europe. And they would receive their funds, their money, by getting bitcoins. So indeed, it's very hard to trace it. But the key here is that these successful drug dealers that made hundreds of thousands of euros each month were not able to spend these bitcoins because you need cash. And they ended up in the local Starbucks and McDonald's in train stations in the Netherlands to actually exchange their bitcoins that they got from their online drug sales. And this is an interesting part because this is where the new types of criminals, so online drug lords selling stuff all over the world, getting bitcoins, this is where that world meets the traditional underworld of the criminals. Of course, here they still needed people that were able to launder large amounts of cash. So here you can see the intertwinement of new networks and old networks, and still these crypto market drug lords still needed their local embeddedness to be able to get their money. And of course, that's the main priority, to get their money. So to wrap it up, we have new high-tech networks, but you also have traditional networks. And we tend to think that cybercrime is all about it's new, it's different, and that's partly true, and that gives us new problems. However, we have to remember that lots of these criminals are just humans and still try to work with people that they actually know. So we definitely see a fair amount of traditional networks here, and we see that cybercrimes and traditional crimes are highly intertwined. Furthermore, I want to emphasize the offline side of cybercrime. As I already mentioned, lots of these networks still heavily rely on offline social context. I think Jonathan Lusthaus, which is a discussant later on, has some excellent work that he did in Romania that shows exactly the same, that these networks there are heavily relying on their offline social context. So we can definitely see that from multiple sources, this is something that we see. And this, of course, gives lots of possibilities for law enforcement to still do some investigations and see who the recruiters are, etc., etc. And the local embeddedness, as I just mentioned in the Bitcoin case, still is very important. I do not want to downplay, of course, the new element of within cybercriminal networks. So these new online offender convergence settings, so the crypto markets or other meeting places, because we definitely see that these online ties are on the rise. So more and more of these ties become online ties, which is definitely going to change the origin and growth processes of these criminal networks. And we definitely see that these offender convergence settings are opportunity structures to quickly expand your criminal capabilities, because we did notice that the criminals that were able to use both their offline networks and their online networks were able to quickly become an international player. And of course, this is something that is new. And last but not least, we see that these crypto markets, or fora in general, are universities of the underworld. So traditionally, I would have said, go to prison. That's where you learn a lot from other criminals. We see prison as the university for criminals. However, now it's changing to forums and crypto markets, because there is a big culture in there where it's completely normal to learn people all sorts of criminal stuff and to discuss new ways to commit fraud, etc., etc. So this is definitely something new and very interesting to see what it means to the criminal careers of young offenders. So this is it for me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them after the presentation, and you can also contact me directly in the future on the email address that you see on the sheet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lukefeld, for your insightful presentation on the interaction between human factors and cybercriminal networks. And I respect your enthusiastic, positivist endeavor. Now, the next presenter is Dr. Benoit Dupont. Dr. Dupont is a professor of criminology at Université de Montréal, where he also holds a Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity and the Research Chair in the Prevention of Cybercrime. Professor Dupont will give presentation on cybercrime and government responses in the time of COVID-19. We look to understand how cybercriminals adapt existing fraudulent schemes to the new context created by COVID-19. Professor Dupont, the floor is yours.
So hello, and thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity given to me to present to this great audience. My name is Benoit Dupont. I'm a professor of criminology at the Université de Montréal in Canada. And the title of my presentation today is Cybercrime and Government Responses in the Time of COVID. The outline of my presentation will deal with the co-evolution of cybercrime and cyber threats in a time of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently experiencing. I will look at the co-evolution of the virus, which is a biological virus, and how the digital viruses and infections have co-evolved alongside this biological virus. I will also look at how cyber criminals and cyber offenders have exploited and leveraged the current feeling of fear and uncertainty. And I will also briefly look at the government responses in 9 countries, the G7 countries, plus the Netherlands and Australia, to try to assess how effective those responses have been. And finally, I will conclude by a few thoughts on cyber resilience as maybe a substitute to cybersecurity. COVID-19, as we've discovered, has not only been a terrible public health crisis, but also has amplified a number of online risks, among which cybercrime figures prominently. Why? Because it enhanced levels of uncertainty and fear among the population, which has sought a lot of information online and sometimes in places that have been compromised by cyber criminals and cyber attackers. Also because with the lockdowns imposed by many countries, millions of workers have shifted overnight to remote work or work from home arrangements, where they have been forced to work with applications and in environments that were not necessarily very conducive to security. Thirdly, because the critical infrastructures on which we rely to deliver public health and care to sick people and to people infected by the virus have also been proven to be very fragile and very exposed to digital attacks. And finally, because the quest, the race for a vaccine has also exacerbated a number of espionage and disruptive behaviors from nation states that have actually compromised the health of our digital ecosystem. So COVID-19 is the perfect example of what my Dutch colleagues call a transboundary crisis, which is a crisis that affects multiple jurisdictions. So it's a global pandemic undermines the functioning of various policy sectors and critical infrastructures. So, for example, in the case of COVID-19, the public health institutions have been stressed and have been really tested. Digital infrastructures as well have been tested. National security has also been stressed. And of course, transport, infrastructures, accommodation, tourism, and many other policy sectors have been affected by COVID-19. A transboundary crisis is also a crisis that escalates very rapidly and morphs along the way. And there is still a lot of uncertainty about COVID-19 and what will happen next. So there is no existing model of that can predict what will happen in a few weeks or in a few months. And for all those reasons, those transboundary crises are extremely difficult to manage and very challenging for governments and even the private sector to address. So I would like to look at very briefly the ways that cyber criminals have adapted and have leveraged the COVID-19 crisis to transform their existing strategies to victimize individuals and organizations. And I will look at a handful of changes that have occurred for the past 8 months. So the first type of cybercrime that has evolved as a result of COVID-19 are online scams. They have been delivered on a constant basis since the beginning of the crisis by email, by SMS, through websites. And basically, they consist in cyber criminals exploiting the need for information and protection of individuals to offer them fake vaccines, fake testing kits, fake or counterfeited protective equipment, fake travel authorizations in exchange for money. And this effectiveness of online scams is fueled by the disorganization of government communications during the early days of the pandemic and even up until now. So it's maybe too early to assess at this stage if COVID-19 generated higher profits for cyber criminals and the extent of those increased profits, but there is a certainty is that really it has enabled new types of scams at massive scales. It also has enabled cyber criminals to increase the effectiveness of the distribution of malware-enabled data theft stratagems. So this is a screen capture of a malware called Farade, which is an information stealer where cyber criminals are exploiting, again, the appetite and the need for information that people have with a title that pretends to give them some of this information on coronavirus affected company staff to convince people to click on the link and to download a malicious piece of software. And the purpose here is not to defraud people or to extort money, but more to acquire and to steal personal information that can then be repackaged and sold on underground illicit markets. In the field of fraud, a third type of fraud that was massively exploited by organized cybercrime groups is the exploitation of the financial aid programs that were launched by governments all across the world to try to salvage collapsing economies and to try to support families and businesses throughout this crisis. So the governments hastily deployed social benefit programs and business support programs, emergency programs that consisted of hundreds of billions of dollars very often, but with limited time and hence limited controls, so that it enabled cybercrime gangs to exploit these windows of opportunities and to submit fake claims on behalf of the people they had stolen the identity of. And of course, those people were doubly victimized, because when they tried to claim actually those benefits for themselves, they discovered that someone had already made such claim, and they had to clear their name before they were able to enjoy those benefits. So it's hard to assess at this stage, but probably at least in the US, 2 to 3% of those government programs resulted in fraudulent claims, which doesn't seem to be that much, except when you consider that those programs consisted in hundreds of billions of dollars. So the estimate is that tens of billions of dollars were defrauded in the process. Also, cyber criminals exploited COVID-19 to launch disruption campaigns under the guise of distributed denial of service attacks or ransomware attacks. And those attacks exploited the fatigue and the exhaustion of personnel working in critical infrastructures and at home, but in particular at hospitals and research labs. And we heard a lot of horror stories about that. And they also exploited the sense of urgency that was attached to the work of critical infrastructures and public health institutions. And as an example, a university in California paid a $1 million ransom because otherwise it would have lost the research it was doing on a potential COVID-19 vaccine. So a lot of malware disruptions occurred as a result, exploiting, again, the uncertainty and the exhaustion and the fatigue of internet users. Also, in the same kind of configuration, millions of people started to work from home overnight, increasing the number of devices connecting to corporate systems from outside of the protected areas, accessing corporate data over consumer networks. Users also working from home were a lot more distracted, because very often their family was holed up with them in the same dwelling, received very limited security support, had to work using applications they were not familiar with and for which they hadn't received any kind of security training. So overall, we saw a decrease in the effectiveness of security controls, and that resulted in a number of attacks and higher rates of infections, of digital infections. Finally, cyber criminals were very opportunistic and exploited also the launch of contact tracing apps developed by governments to try to digitalize the contact tracing operations to slow down the spread of the virus. And for example, in Canada, and this is a screen capture from Canada, cyber criminals set up fake websites pretending to come from Health Canada and made available fake apps only 6 days after the government of Canada announced it was going to produce, design, and deliver a contact tracing app. So you see the fast speed at which cyber criminals are able to leverage government initiatives to convince people to download malicious software and to access privileged information. So if we try to map all those online risks, we see that there are three main categories of malicious actors that were involved. Cyber criminals driven by the need to generate financial profits, government hackers trying to launch espionage operations to appropriate intellectual property, and state-sponsored hackers coming in between, semi-autonomous from government institutions. Basically, they launched into three different kinds of objectives: to defraud victims, to steal data, to resell those personal informations, and to appropriate intellectual property, and also destabilize adversary governments. And in terms of victims, we see 5 different categories of victims: individuals, businesses, critical infrastructures, a specific sector of critical infrastructures, the health sector, and government systems. And what we see through this flow chart is that actually when you're a victim, you have to account for and prepare for different types of attacks and different types of risks. So you have to be prepared for a variety of risks that evolve. And we can also see that attackers sometimes launch different types of attacks. So it's not so easy to detect and to predict exactly what attackers are going to do. So there is really a cybercrime coevolution that we saw over the past 8 months. It's interesting to see that when you're mapping what cyber criminals did, they followed local developments in the pandemic and the diffusion of the pandemic. Most of the scams and online attacks we recorded started in Asia and then moved to Europe and then later on to North America. And those patterns closely reflect the spread of the virus and very quickly are able to exploit changes in the statistics of infections and the rates of infections. They also very often are able to identify the most vulnerable sectors and the most vulnerable individuals and to exploit those social or organizational vulnerabilities. And we see that they have really, cyber criminals, a very, very high level of adaptation, which is very rarely matched by public organizations in charge of defending computer systems. In terms of the timeline, you can see the spread of those frauds, the attacks against hospitals, when you see the rise in the number of people being admitted to hospitals in Europe and North America, government programs being launched very immediately, frauds start to happen, attacks again, contact tracing applications later on in the beginning of the summer, and phishing campaigns remain quite stable throughout the whole 8-month period. When we look at government responses, we mainly are able to categorize those responses in 3 categories, 3 buckets: prevention, response, and recovery. So the before, during, and after, hopefully. In terms of prevention, lots of awareness campaigns were launched on social media, providing guidance to individuals, businesses, and critical health infrastructures. But what we found is that very often they didn't have a very broad reach in the population, and they were limited in their capacity to reach large numbers of people. And in general, there was a lack of preparation that we observed, except maybe in a couple of countries such as the UK. And the prevention programs were very static. They didn't evolve as quickly as the threats and as the types of cybercrimes that were deployed. So sometimes the prevention and the awareness campaigns were somehow disconnected from the content of the scam and phishing emails that people were receiving. In terms of response, limited government capacity to support mitigation activities through such a massive crisis, limited citizen engagement to help with the detection and mitigation of threats, such as suspicious emails, except in the UK, where a system was implemented to help people declare suspicious emails and to help the authorities suppress those emails. And in terms of response, we saw important intergovernmental partnerships with, for example, the Five Eyes countries and European Union countries, public-private partnerships, not so great partnerships between the national and the local governments in those 9 countries that we studied. And finally, in terms of recovery, probably too early to assess. What we know is the technical resilience of the digital infrastructure, the internet, the cloud, was quite robust. What wasn't so robust is the capacity of the critical infrastructure in the health sector to deal with, for example, cyber attacks and ransomware, which in fact are quite easy to prevent and could have been prevented and mitigated much more easily. So it leads me to conclude that by saying that cyber resilience, which is the capacity to limit the impact of cyber disruption and to restore normal operations following a cyber incident and to adapt to a new threat landscape is not so developed. We only witnessed a handful of countries that seem to have developed some good cyber resilience. In the UK, we saw a very nimble communication strategy to adapt to the new threat landscape, relying on new social media platform. In Australia, massive investments pledged over 10 years to enhance the level of preparedness. In Canada, it's not on my slide, but some interesting new partnerships between academic research labs and intelligence agencies to try to better help those research labs protect against cyber attacks. But overall, I think we're still lagging behind in terms of cyber resilience. And I think it's one of the lessons probably of this crisis. We need to maybe recognize that cybersecurity is probably not enough, and we need to really adopt a more cyber resilient posture or approach, which is more focused on the future and tries to develop the capacities to operate in very highly uncertain environment. I'm going to stop here because I want to leave some time for Q&As. But if you'd like to contact me or to reach out to me or to download some of my papers, feel free to email me or to visit this website. Thank you very much for the quality of your attention.
Thank you, Professor Dufong, for your keen analysis on how cyber criminals exploit people's vulnerability deepened by COVID-19 and expert view on governmental response strategy. And I think your organic conception of cyber resilience very useful tool to analyze government's response strategy. Now, next and our last presenter is Dr. Haesung Yoon. Dr. Yoon is Senior Research Fellow of KIC and a consultant to Korean National Police Agency, National Counterterrorism Center. Dr. Yoon will give a presentation on application of fraud and remediation for crime victimization on voice phishing method. We look to understand the Korean legislative and policy responses to voice phishing phenomenon and its various types of victimizations. Dr. Yoon, the floor is yours.
소개받은 한국 형사정책.
Hello, I'm Yoon Hae-sung from KIC. So our institute organizes these international fora every December of the year, inviting renowned experts to talk about cybercrime, corruption, and terrorism. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to transition the meeting to a virtual format, which leaves a lot of regrets on our part. But our international cooperation team actually has put in a lot of efforts to prepare for this meeting. And of course, it would have been great if we had an offline meeting. And KIC has done a lot of research. So what I would like to present to you is to introduce Korea's unique legal framework based on the research work conducted by KIC. So I would like to deliver my presentation on the topic of voice phishing. So voice phishing is not a traditional cybercrime per se. You had farming and phishing in the past. So this is a representative crime that would use cyberspace or cybercrime, as was the speaker from Canada spoke about. It is made of dotted organizations. It's an international organization using phishing and farming and conducting all of the attacks in the cyberspace. So this voice phishing can be perceived as a cybercrime. So you use private data using voice to phish that data. So this is a new words combining voice, private data, and phishing. If you look at the literature review in Korea, there have been largely two trends in Korea. It's a credit loan fraud that's requesting personal and financial information by luring potential victims into their fake websites. And the user would access the site and thinking that it is a real website would provide personal and financial information to that website. So the fraud using that genuine personal and financial information, would go to the actual real site and enter that information to go through authentication process and take cash or to do a transfer of money into his or her account. That is what we have seen in terms of card loan fraud in Korea. So whether it is phishing or farming, they would use those tools to lure the user to a fake website. So how do we treat this under the current criminal act? That is a controversies or debates that we have, because the fake websites are used for committing a crime, and a user thinking that that is an actual site actually enter that information by him, herself, or herself, and the fraud would be able to utilize that information to take property from the actual site or make the cash card to extract money. That is a type of behavior that we saw. So from the point of the victim could think that I had no idea what was going on, and I thought that was a real, genuine website, and I put in my personal information and financial information. How would you be able to treat that as a fraud? Because it is actually seen as a pre-execute phase to fraud. So it is quite questionable whether that act of obtaining personal financial information can be admitted to this. So now let's take a look at the types of voice phishing frauds. There are 4 different types. First is compensation type. For example, this is a type of attracting victims for winning prizes or for refunding overpaid pensions, insurance, or taxes. The person would be lured to go to the ATM to put personal information to take the money out. Second is the security type. This is a type of attracting the victims from financial information, leaks, or involvement in crimes. So the person is told by the criminal that the person is at risk of infringement, so you would have to go to the ATM to put some money in to protect yourself. And the third is a blackmail type. This is, for example, deceiving victims into believing that their child has been abducted. The fourth type is charging duty. This is a type of attracting victims to pay membership fees for alumni associations or additional tuition fees. But as you can see from different typologies, for the blackmail type and for the charging duty type, the person is aware that the money is being provided to the criminal or to the person. So that's a punishable act, and the person is aware that the money is being transferred. But the problem actually occurs with the first 2 types, compensation and the security types. You will be able to learn from later examples that the person is not aware that the money is being issued from his or her account. Now, the person is not aware that the disposal of the property is being made. So whether that constitutes an element of fraud or not. Hence the controversies that we see in the current discourse. Let's take a look at the current criminal act of Korea. First of all, there has to be an act of deception. And from that, there has to be a disposal activity. And it has to lead to property losses or damages. And the person has to be aware of that. And once the property losses incur, then the fraud takes the gains made from the property disposal. Then it becomes an element of a crime for fraud under the current criminal act. But as you saw from the previous examples, there has to be an act of disposal of a property. Only then such behavior would constitute crime element. So let's go back to the fraud element again. Let's say that there's a refund type, or there's a security type, or blackmail type of an act. Let's say that this surprises occur, then the victim would have to do whatever is told by the criminal. And the criminal would impersonate himself or herself as a police officer and would tell the victim to do certain things, telling the person to go to the ATM, and he or she would tell the victim that the phone call will be made in 5 minutes, and then the victim goes to the ATM, will wait for the call to come through, and picks up the phone, and the fraud will give specific instructions as to, for example, what to do with the ATM. So this is the only way that you can, for example, clear yourself of any suspicions. So it's a luring activity. So the person will go through the authentication process with the ATM, and the authentication code will be given, for example, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or other codes will be given to the person, and also the security code will be given by the criminal. 245, 267, the codes will be given to the victim, but that's actually an account number of the criminal that will be used later on. And the security code is actually the amount of money that will be transferred out of the victim's account. So the victim has been deceived at this point. And so the victim has no idea that the money is being transferred out of her or his account to a criminal's account. So under the Criminal Act, this act is not perceived as a disposal activity. Because there's an absence of disposal, such act was not punishable under the fraud element. So there's a compensation type and the security type. There's a lack of disposal. However, for the blackmail type and the charging duty type, the victim actually transmits or transfers money out of the bank account, so any act of transfer would be punishable under the fraud crime. So again, the third and the fourth type can be punished under the fraud crime element, but the first and second cannot be punished under the fraud element. But fortunately, in 2017, such loophole was to be addressed. There was an on-bank Supreme Court decision made, especially looking at this very sophisticated and advanced voice phishing crimes. Even if there's an absence of disposal of a property, such credit card loans or security type or the compensation types could still be punishable under the fraud crime element, even if there was an absence of, again, the disposal of a property. So that was a decision made by the Supreme Court back in 2017. Nevertheless, because such on-bank Supreme Court decision was not available, there was an argument that we would have to review this under the Criminal Act. Now, there is a computer-aided fraud crime which can be applied to the Voice Phishing Act. For example, the person is lured to the ATM to make a transfer. So the person, the victim, is actually used as an accessory to the crime. So the person is to be seen as a principal through innocent human agent. The criminal is to be seen as a principal through innocent human agent, because the victim was actually used in the act of crime. So in 2017, but the Supreme Court made that decision en banc. So this act of using an innocent human agent is still punishable by fraud crime element. Even if there's an absence of disposal of property under the voice phishing. So there was that Supreme Court decision made. So such voice phishing crimes can be punished as a fraud crime in Korea. And I want to introduce to you a very unique legal framework that we have. When we did the research before, for example, the victims would be deceived by voice phishing criminal, and within 20 minutes, other frauds, for example, the co-offenders would take that money out of the bank account and would transfer safely that money to another account. Then the victim will be made aware only then that he or she was deceived and would make a report, but you would have to make that report right away and to the police, and the money, the account would have to be frozen, which means that you have to actually go to the separate bank to ask for that request to put a freeze on the bank transactions, and it would really take up a lot of time. So in order for the person to actually get that money back, he or she would have to file a litigation. So there's a very long time period needed, also costing a lot of money. That is why the victim, in most of the time, would not be able to get a recourse for the damages, which led to these issues over the loopholes in the legal framework. So over the course of 1 year, the National Assembly was involved in this consultation, and a special act was legislated as a result. So the biggest change is that they were different reporting systems across the board. Some of the benchmarks were used from Japan and Taiwan. Now here, the victim is aware that he or she has been a victim of voice phishing, and a report will be made to the police. And the police will say, please wait, and we will talk to the financial authorities, and we will make a report. So please make sure to report to your financial authorities, for example, to ask for the suspension. So make sure that the person is able to wait online without hanging up the phone, and the financial authorities will answer the phone, and the request will be made by the victim for suspending the bank account transactions, and that request will be accepted right away. So that is what we're doing. So it's very real time. For example, you would have to separately report to the police and also to the financial authorities, and at least minimum 6 months will be needed in order to get a recourse for the losses. But once you make a report to the police, you'll be instantly rerouted to the financial authorities to make a request for the suspension of payment. And Japanese law was used as a benchmark. Let's say that the fraud doesn't show up, because a fraud will then have to admit that he or she has committed a crime. So the fraud doesn't actually appear. So up until that actual owner appears, then there's a 2 months of a bond waiting period. And unless the person appears, then the money will be put back to the original owner's account. That is the Special Act on the Prevention of Losses Caused by Telecommunications-Based Financial Fraud and Refund for Loss. In short, Voice Phishing Special Act. But still, the behaviors of crime are becoming very intelligent and diversified. So the Supreme Prosecutor's Office, as well as police agency and financial authorities, are working very hard in collaboration to respond to such voice phishing crimes. What I would like to emphasize is that the government, institute, or organizations would never request an individual to provide financial information, especially will never lure an individual to go to the ATM to put some number in. So don't be fooled, don't be deceived by voice phishing criminals. And if you have been deceived, you need to make a report to the police right away. That was quite a short presentation, but I've talked about the typologies of voice phishing in Korea and also the remedial procedures in place. And I will take questions later during the discussion session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Yoon, for your well-articulated and informative presentation on types of voice phishing and judicial and legislative responses to them in Korea. Now, I would like to proceed to the discussion session. We have 3 expert discussants who will engage in informed discussion with the presenter. Before starting, I will briefly introduce our 3 discussants. First, Dr. Jonathan Lusthaus is the director of the Human Cybercriminal Project at the Department of Sociology, University of Oxford. Professor Ho-Jin Choi is from Dankook University College of Law, and Professor Sang-Kyu Kim is from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies Law School. They will make general comments and raise informed questions on the speakers' presentations. Each pair of a presenter and a discussant will have a 10-minute discussion. Yeah. Dr. Lustos, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me discuss Rutger's paper, and thank you very much for the paper. I think it's a very interesting topic. It's an area that I think a lot of people should be familiar with if they're interested in cybercrime research, particularly from a criminology angle. And I think the reason for this, as Rutger was talking about in his paper, was around the fact that a lot of the past research in this area, and actually a lot of the research still being done today, uses data from forums, uses data from online marketplaces. I think that's probably still the dominant strain. And I think what is seen clearly through the work that Rutger's done is that that only captures really a small part of the cybercrime world. We're only really seeing the trade, we're only really seeing an online element. And if you just use those types of methodologies, which often are using potentially large data sets, it could be forums with thousands of members. Sometimes these studies are using multiple forums. So you could be potentially talking about a huge number of posts, a huge amount of data, and the analysis really is trying to capture that macro level. And that has its place, and there's value to understanding that particular dimension of cybercrime. But I think what Rutger shows is really much more in the micro level. When you employ this type of case study method, you really start to find out other details that are missing through what you only see through online data, through digital data. And you really start to see things that are different components of the cybercrime kind of chain, in a sense. You're seeing not just the trade, but also the carrying out of the crimes themselves, how people meet, how people interact. These are really, really important questions. And I think Rutger's made a huge contribution in this area. And I think the only way you can make it is by employing different types of methods and data from this kind of standard forum approach. And it's certainly something I believe in very strongly myself through some of the work that I've done around interviews and other areas. But I think this case study method is very, very neat in terms of providing a kind of granular level understanding of cybercrime that you can't get through certain other sources. So to me, that's very, very important. Finding out about clusters, finding out about these offline components is really key here. In terms of, I guess, thinking about question for Rutger in terms of where this might go, and I'm very interested in the kind of future of this type of method. So I should say it's not the only method you could use. I would encourage really employing a whole range of different methods to cybercrime research that haven't been employed at this point. But for the case study method, seeing the value of what's been done already, my question for Rutger would be around what's the future of this? Because it seems to me if we're thinking about the micro and the macro, this method is really great at discovering the micro elements of cybercrime, really seeing how some of these groups work down to even the individual human level, the individual offender level. And it seems very easy to replicate this method. So Rutger's done this in a lot of cases in the Netherlands. He's done this in other countries. There's other researchers. I've started investigating this method as well in some UK cases. I think it has broad application really all over the world. You could do it on Korean cases. You could do it on any country you'd pick, as long as there's cybercrime happening there. And there's a certain level of cooperation from the police and law enforcement, you could replicate this method. So you could almost have an endless number of cases that you could analyze. And so that's really interesting because you could start to look for variation. You could start to really trying to sort of map what cybercrime looks like globally, not just on this one sort of level in particular countries. So my particular question for Rutger would be around, at that point, you're moving then actually from the micro to the macro. You've built so many cases through the work that you're doing or through the work that others around the world are doing, and that's potentially very useful. But then what does that look like at that level? Once you move to that macro level, what would be the way you'd approach that kind of now becoming maybe quite a large N type of study instead of a small N study? So you're hitting the point of, do you start to look a little bit more like some of these big marketplaces studies in terms of very large data sets? How would you kind of bridge this micro-macro divide? What do you think is the future of this area in terms of the case study method in driving knowledge forward and getting a kind of more complete understanding of how cybercrime cases work, not just in the Netherlands and not just in certain other countries in Europe or the US, but really around the world? So that would be the focus of my discussion question for Rutger that I'd be very interested to hear his opinions on. But thank you very much for the excellent presentation and for the excellent conference.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lusthaus. Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, I happen to write a chapter at this moment with Professor Clemens from the Netherlands, who is highly specialized in doing the same sort of analysis on organized crime for about 20 or 30 years. And we're writing the chapter about the use of police files when it comes to researching cybercrime and the added value of it. So I think this fits perfectly with the stuff we're dealing with right now, because as a method, using police files or other data from law enforcement is highly relevant, because it gives you, all of these insights about criminal networks that you just don't get any other way. You might be able to get some of these insights by interviewing offenders, but you would still have to deal with people not telling you everybody and not everything, and you not be able to talk to any criminal. So I think the pros of using these police files are, you get so much detailed information. As you said, you have these perfect case descriptions. So of course the downside is that you have case descriptions, so you do not have 100,000 cases, and you will never get that, just because it can take you weeks to analyze one case, maybe even more sometimes. So it's just something that will never be comparable to analyzing a forum, because a forum, I read papers in which there were thousands of members on each forum with hundreds of thousands of interactions, and we're never going to get that using police files. And I don't think that should be the future. I think the future should be trying to combine much more than we do now, trying to combine different methods, because in my sense, and I don't know if you agree and if others agree here, but the scholars, especially criminologists, tend to stay in their own discipline. So if you're a qualitative researcher, you're doing your interviews, you're doing case analysis, and if you're a quantitative researcher, you only want the big data. And I think we really should move towards more integrating these two. And that's very difficult, but I do really think that we can learn lots from each other, because when I look at the analysis on forum data, I see lots of things that I don't think are relevant, because the things that we learn from the cases, but the other way around might also be true. So I would really like to move forward from these divided disciplines into much more integrating them. Of course, that's not going to happen if we don't start it. So if anybody has any ideas, feel free to contact any of us, I guess. But a very pragmatic future that I see is, I think we proved in the Netherlands that you can definitely use police files to, gain, very, very new insights that you don't get in any other way, right? I think that's something that we clearly showed. What we also showed is that you could also not use police files, because not every country is going to let their scholars look at the raw data as we can get access to. So what we did is we not only analyzed these police files, we also did case reconstructions based on interviews with police officers involved in analyzing these, in investigating these criminals. And it turned out that when you talk about a case level analysis, you can pretty much get the same results analyzing police files yourself for 2 weeks, or doing 2 interviews with people involved in the case. Of course, analyzing the case will give you much more of the deep insights. It gives you all of the interactions between criminals and stuff like that. But it turned out that police officers or other people involved in the criminal investigation were also able to discuss that with us and actually help us rebuild these cases. So therefore, even in countries where you might not have access to police files as a researcher, you can still do these case reconstructions. So I would really hope that with the standard analytical frameworks that we now developed over the past decade or so, that others are going to use that in other countries and build upon the work that we've done. Because I think it's true that we've done more and more cases. However, the first 18 that I did were all phishing cases. Then we added another 22, which were phishing and banking malware. So still related at a very specific type of crime. In the analysis after that, using the Organized Crime Monitor in the Netherlands, we focused especially on crypto markets. So in each and every wave of data collection, we focused on another type of cybercrime. And we only have 3 now, but there are many, many more out there. And I think the big questions here are, if you're going to do the same type of analysis on other types of crimes, such as ransomware or other types of cybercrime, maybe even more the cyber-enabled crimes, do we still get the same picture there or not? Because I think that's very important. And I think the stuff we're doing and the stuff you're doing in the UK are just the first steps into really getting the knowledge about the fundamental aspects of origin and growth process, for example. So I really think that we're no way as far that you can already say, well, we already have so many cases analyzed that we now know everything about cybercriminal networks. I think we're just making the first steps, and I truly hope that other countries are going to use the analytical frameworks that we published and are going to apply that to other types of cybercrime, so we can see whether or not these things that we see are true for all criminal networks or not. I don't know if this answers your question, Jonathan, but feel free to add one more if you're not satisfied.
No, that's a good answer. I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your discussion. Next our discussant is Professor Ho-Jin Choi. Yeah, Professor Choi, the floor is yours.
예, 안녕하십니까.
Hello, my name is Choi Ho-jin of Dankook University. I have been asked to provide a discussion for the cyber economic crime session. I would like to thank KIC for giving me this very important opportunity. I do have 4 questions on cybercrime. First of all, on the severity of cyber economic crimes, on national security and human security, on cyber crime strategy, and lastly, on the situation in the Canadian academic community. First, on the severity of cyber economic crimes, our presenter talked about cyber fraud and voice phishing, and this is obviously a situation that impacts not just Korea, but this is a very severe problem that the world is facing. Because of COVID-19, we're seeing an accelerated rise into more virtual transactions. So we're seeing a lot of activity moving from the real economy to the digital economy. And this is leading to fears that we're going to see more different kinds of cybercrime activity in the future. Recently, we've seen many instances in Korea where the proceeds of cybercrime are being kept in the form of cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are being used in money laundering purposes as well. So this is going to be a very important legal issue going forward. The legal status of cryptocurrencies, the trading exchanges, credibility issue, money laundering of cryptocurrencies, and forfeiture and confiscation of cryptocurrencies. So I want to understand what your thoughts are on cryptocurrencies, especially on keeping the proceeds of crime in the form of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. What are some of the cryptocurrency-related issues right now in the academic community in Canada? If you would like to share with us some of the research trends, that would be very helpful. My next question is on national security and human security. I think that cybersecurity touches both on national security and human security as well. Cyber attacks are being increasingly placed on privacy and the property of individuals. The concept of human security was first put forth by UNDP in 1994. There are 7 different kinds of security concepts under the theme of human security, but there is no mention of cybersecurity. And that I find to be a little bit unfortunate. I think that it would be best to add the notion of cybersecurity in the concept of human security. So my question to you here is what your thoughts are on the concept of human security, going beyond the concept of national security. If you can recognize the concept of human security, what are your thoughts on the addition of the concept of cybersecurity into that umbrella? My third question is on cybersecurity strategy. I think that there needs to be a need for national level cybersecurity strategies. As you know, Korea is an ICT powerhouse and it has very strong digital infrastructure. We see cyberspace as not just a place for corporate economic activity and public administrative services, but it is also used increasingly by individuals. But because of cybercrime, there's leading more damage by individuals. which is why in 2019, the Korean government established a national cybersecurity strategy with a vision, 3 kinds of objectives, and 3 kinds of principles. And so under the National Cybersecurity Strategy, there are very specific sub-strategies involved. But in this National Cybersecurity Strategy, there is no mention of cyber economic crimes. Oh, I think that there needs to be more mention of these cyber economic crimes in the National Cybersecurity Strategy. My question to you is, what is the situation like in Canada? Does Canada have its own national cybersecurity strategy? Or if there are any public level strategies like this, if you can share that with us, that would be very helpful. And what are your thoughts on the Korean national cybersecurity strategy? And my last question is on the research trends, the latest research trends in Canada, especially relating to cyber threat. I am also personally very much interested in cybercrime, and I'm working very hard to engage in research related to cybercrime. What are the latest research trends related to cybercrime in Canada? Can you tell us more about the situation in the academic community in Canada? And what are your own personal areas of research? That would be very helpful to further my understanding. With that, I would like to conclude my discussion with these different questions, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Dr. Choi, for your very thoughtful remarks and questions, which I will try to answer within the next 5 minutes. The first question you have for me is, what is your view on cryptocurrency-related crime, and in particular on criminal proceeds stored in the form of cryptocurrency? It's really difficult for me to know what share of money laundering activities are migrating to cryptocurrency platforms. What I know is that law enforcement organizations in Canada are becoming more aware of it and training their investigators to make sure that they're able to track and to seize those criminal proceeds when needed. I also have colleagues in Montreal who are monitoring and tracking the transactions on underground illicit markets on the dark web, such as my colleague David Descaries-Hétu at Université de Montréal. Also others who study the hacking risks associated with the growing use of legitimate cryptocurrency schemes, but I cannot really tell you more about that. And myself, I also studied the transactions and the with Australian and Canadian colleagues transactions in the ransomware industry, so showing that it was not as profitable as expected, but it caused massive amounts of damages among business and individual victims. The second question you have for me is in regard to the concept of human security, and I entirely agree with you that cybersecurity has been for too long too closely associated with national security, and that we need criminologists and legal scholars to play a larger role in those conversations by showing, for example, the harm done to individual victims and the need to design and to implement policies that invest as much in the fight against cybercrime than in defenses, in defense organizations, investments in defense organizations to fight against cyber espionage or attacks against critical infrastructures. The idea of human security, I think, could be a useful umbrella for this renewed approach, but I'm a strong proponent of human-centric cybersecurity, which is an approach that seeks to blend multiple disciplines in the social sciences to ensure that cybersecurity policies and technologies are deployed to answer the needs of individual users instead of asking those users to adjust their behaviors to poorly designed technologies that are very easily exploited by cyber criminals. The third question has to do with the Canadian government and the existence of a national cybersecurity strategy. And yes, Canada has published and released in 2018 a national cybersecurity strategy, which was the second such strategy in the history of our country. it rests on three pillars. The first one is the enhancement of the resilience of critical infrastructures, businesses, and individuals against cyber attacks. So it's a technical capacity that the government of Canada seeks to develop through the creation of a Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. The second pillar is the pillar that seeks to make sure that cybersecurity also becomes an engine of economic prosperity through research and development initiatives and programs. And thirdly, the policy and the strategy seeks to develop a governance framework and capacities to enable the collaboration between various levels of government, the private sector, and academia to make sure there is a real convergence of capacities and strategies and practices and technologies. I don't know enough about the Korean context to be able to make an assessment, but what I believe is that comparative approaches are really needed, and I think we need to compare national strategies to see what works, what doesn't, and what's promising. Finally, I think that your fourth question was about what I think are major cybercrime-related issues. There are two of them, I think, personally. The one is, first one is that I believe we need to pay a lot more attention to the experiences and the needs of cybercrime victims. I don't think they're properly met or known yet. They appear to suffer mostly for financial harm, but in fact, the psychological and the social harms are also very important, and we need to enhance our knowledge of those harms that afflict them, and we need to develop much more effective cybercrime prevention programs as a result of that increase in knowledge. And secondly, I think that we need to think a lot more about the role police should play in the fight against cybercrime and its prevention, in particular, how it could better coordinate other government agencies and the private sector for the common good to fight and to prevent cybercrime. So this is all the time I've got for now. Thank you very much for your question, very thoughtful questions, very stimulating, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your discussion. Our last discussant is Professor Seong-Kyu Kim. Professor Kim, the floor is yours.
So I'm going to be making a comment on Dr. Yoon's presentation. I am Kim Seong-Kyu. So Dr. Yoon talked about two different categories related to voice phishing. First is with regards to voice phishing, whether that constitutes an element of fraud under the Criminal Act, and also talked about remedial procedures that are involved for the victims of voice phishing crimes. Actually, I really didn't have a lot of knowledge about the remediation process, and through your presentation, I was able to learn a lot, so I thank you for that. I'm a criminologist, a legal expert, so rather than focusing extensively on remediation process, I want to focus my talk on applicability of fraud to the voice phishing crimes. And I do have a couple of questions for you, Dr. Yoon. First of all, you talked about different types of deception. You gave us 4 different categories of deception using voice phishing. First is, the fourth one is the charging duty type. This is where the criminal is using an identity of a third person, giving the number of the account, and making the victim to transfer money into his or her account. So the victim over here is aware that the money is being transferred from his or her own account to a different person. So I believe that fraud can be applicable to this point. But if you look at Article 347 of the Criminal Act, So it's a person who defrauds another, thereby taking property or obtaining pecuniary advantage from another. So it is limited to these two different behaviors here. So can we actually perceive the situation in which a person is actually taking property or is obtaining pecuniary advantage from another? So especially in relation to the phone fraud or telecommunications fraud or voice phishing, this actually involves a financial intermediary between the criminal and the victim. So this needs to be explained further. But of course, both of the behaviors will constitute an element of fraud. But for a court to actually make a conviction, it has to be based on specific provision of the law. Second question is going back to the 4 different categories of deception. For the compensation type, for example, authentication code or the security code is to be entered by the victim so that the criminal would in the end take the financial gains or the properties. For example, the refund fraud. You said that in relation to the constitution of the fraud, you gave us a case involving the Supreme Court, involving the disposal activity, which I believe is very meaningful. And also in relation to the phone fraud, telecommunication fraud, I believe that that specific case really is quite relevant in that regards. But my question is this. Looking at the first type of compensation, which is the refund type of deception, authentication code is to be entered or the security code is to be entered directly by the victim. So the act itself, does that constitute an element of fraud? Can it be seen as a disposal of property? I still have a big question mark over that. But of course, the Supreme Court, in relation to the constitution of the fraud, it doesn't really have to be related to the actual result of the property disposal. Only if there's an intent to that. But there has to be an objective behavior that such property has been taken. But the fact that the person has actually entered the authentication code, can we really perceive that or interpret that as an act of disposal? So for those compensation type of behavior, can we apply the fraud element as is? So as Dr. Yoon mentioned, Article 347-2, which is a computer-enabled crime, I think this fraud by use of computers, 347-2, should be applicable for that specific case. So in terms of applicability of the fraud or the applicability of the fraud by use of computer provisions, rather than trying to find a one-on-one comparison or applicability of the provision to a specific type of a crime, I think it would be better for us to actually reclassify the type of crimes here and to realign and to re-examine the current legal framework involving fraud. And what is your view on this? I'd like to get your opinion on that. Thank you very much.
네, 역시
Thank you. You're an expert on criminal act, so I can see that the question was very valid, very to the point. So thank you very much for that very innovative, creative question. So for the first question from Dr. Kim, well, the types are quite similar because it is using phishing or farming to commit a crime. But this information is used to, for example, issue a cash card, and the money will be withdrawn from the bank, and that is taking property from another person. But let's say that bank account, for example, the money is transferred from that bank account to another bank account, then we can say that the person has obtained pecuniary advantage from another. For the refund case, yes, that was an area where I put a lot of thoughts into, because I think along the similar line, if you look at the 2017 En banc Supreme Court's decision, the crimes of voice phishing are becoming very sophisticated and intelligent. Even if the person has been deceived in disposing the property, the fraud crime element is constituted at any rate, even if that specific disposal act did not take place. So that is a very innovative decision indeed. But as I mentioned before in my previous presentation, doing so is quite challenging, and applying that as is quite difficult as well. That is why we're interpreting that as a fraud by use of computer, as a criminal being a principal, using the criminal victim as an innocent human agent. So again, my thoughts are quite similar to your ideas as well. And Professor Kim talked about specific types of behaviors and re-examining the Criminal Act. Yes, I'm getting a lot of questions from people around me, and I'm trying to take that up as a different research agenda. I looked at some of the audit results from last year, and these types are very specifically defined, and we need to have these cases where the Supreme Court's decisions are made. So it's been about 3 years since the last Supreme Court decision was made in 2017, so I'm sure there's a depth of information that we can access. So I will take that as a research item, perhaps being commissioned by a national police agency, and I would like to have you on board as a consultant or advisor. So thank you very much.
Thank you. In the discussion session, our panelists dealt with methodological, conceptual, comparative, jurisprudential, and practical issues related to cyber economic crimes research. I'm sure presentations and discussions must improve our understanding of evolving nature and trends of cyber economic crimes. Now, we have entered the end of the session. I extend once again my deep gratitude to all panelists for taking time to share with us insightful views on cyber financial crime. The second day of the forum is scheduled tomorrow morning, and I look forward to having you again. Please stay healthy and connected. Thank you very much.